Discovery. In the depths of an uncharted star system, a team of Zilothian archaeologists carefully excavated the ruins of an ancient civilization. Amidst the crumbling structures and faded relics, they discovered something remarkable: a suit of armor unlike anything they had ever seen. The armor was clearly not of Zilothian design. In fact, it didn't match any known technology or aesthetics from any spacefaring species. Its contours were both elegant and formidable, the material a shimmering alloy that defied analysis. Under the harsh glare of examination lights, the lead researcher Zylarvex pored over every inch of the armor. His webbed fingers traced the intricate engravings that covered its surface, patterns that seemed to dance and shift before his eyes. There was power here. Zylarvex could feel it thrumming beneath his touch. The Zilothians were not the only ones interested in the armor's secrets. Representatives from a dozen species descended upon the research facility, each eager to be the first to unlock its potential. The Kroll, hulking warriors from a high-gravity world, were certain their strength would prove worthy. They flexed and postured as their champion strapped the armor on, only to be thrown across the room as it violently rejected him. The Elzuri, known for their psychic prowess, believed they could meld with the armor's essence. Their volunteer's eyes rolled back as she tried to make contact, only to slump unconscious, her mind overwhelmed. One by one they tried, the Vorsans with their advanced nanotechnology, the Exilians and their mastery of energy fields, even the mysterious Shapers, who commanded the very fabric of matter. All met with failure, the armor stubbornly inert against their efforts. Zylarvex watched the proceedings with growing frustration, his tendrils twitching in agitation. He had hoped that by inviting others to try, he would glean some insight into the armor's workings. But it seemed this artifact had a will of its own, and it found them all wanting. He couldn't shake the feeling that the armor was waiting for something, or someone. The question burned in his mind as he gazed at it, this enigma that had consumed his every waking thought. What was it seeking, and would they ever be able to provide it? As if in answer, an alarm blared through the facility. Zylarvex spun to the monitors, his heart's racing. There in the landing bay stood a figure unlike any the sensors had ever recorded. Bipedal, with a shock of fur on its head and smooth, pallid skin, it carried no visible weapons, wore no protective gear. By all measures, it seemed almost laughably fragile compared to the specimens that had come before. And yet, as Zylarvex watched the figure stride forward with a confidence that belied its stature, he felt a sudden surge of certainty. Against all odds, a human had come to Zilith Prime. And the armor, he knew with unshakable conviction, had been waiting. The human arrives. Zylarvex and his team watched in stunned disbelief as the human made his way through the facility, escorted by a contingent of heavily armed security personnel. He didn't seem fazed by his surroundings, his gaze taking in the alien architecture and technology with bright, curious eyes. As they entered the lab, the human's eyes immediately locked onto the armor, standing apart from the clutter of equipment and failed tests. A smile played across his strange, flat features. "Well, hello there, beautiful. Aren't you a sight for sore eyes?" Zylarvex stepped forward, his translator crackling to life. "Welcome to Zilith Prime. I am Zylarvex, lead researcher. You are the first human to visit our world. May I ask your name and purpose?" The human's smile widened. "Call me Jake, Jake Hansen. And as for my purpose," he strode towards the armor, heedless of the alarmed murmurs from the gathered researchers. "I'm here for this." Before anyone could react, Jake reached out and laid his hand on the armor's chest plate. Instantly, it flared to life, intricate patterns blazing with light. The armor seemed to ripple and flux, reshaping itself to Jake's form as he watched in apparent satisfaction. "Yeah, that's the stuff. Always feels a little tingly the first time." Zylarvex could only gape, his mind whirling. You've worn this before." Jake winked. "Once or twice, though not for a long, long time." He turned back to the armor, now fully encasing him like a second skin. It had transformed from its bulky, angular form into something sleeker, more streamlined. Jake flexed his arms experimentally, and the armor moved with him, fluid and responsive. The other researchers surged forward, questions tumbling from every mouth. How was this possible? What was the human's connection to the armor? What secrets did he know? But Jake held up a hand, and to Zilarvex's shock, they all fell silent. There was an undeniable aura of command about the human now, an intensity that demanded respect. I know you have questions, and I'll answer what I can. But first, we have work to do. His expression turned grave, the humor fading from his eyes. Because this little reunion isn't a coincidence. The Vorlons are coming. And trust me when I say, you're going to need this armor and my help if you want to survive what's coming. Zilarvex felt a chill run through him at the unfamiliar name, the weight of Jake's words. He looked to the others, saw his own fear and confusion mirrored in their faces. But beneath that, he saw something else kindling, something that had been sorely lacking in all their efforts to unlock the armor's potential. Hope. And for the first time since they had unearthed this ancient marvel, Zilarvex began to believe they might yet unravel its mysteries, with a human, of all the galaxy's wonders, at their side. Unlocking the armor's secrets. In the days that followed, the research facility became a hive of activity, centered around the enigmatic human and his bond with the alien armor. Jake submitted to a dizzying array of tests and scans, patiently explaining what he could of the armor's workings. It's called the Aegis, he told Zilarvex as they pored over the latest batch of sensor readings. Forged by a race known as the progenitors, long before any of our civilizations took to the stars. Zilarvex nodded, his mind racing with the implications, and its purpose. Protection, primarily. But also, Jake hesitated, his eyes distant. Judgment. The progenitors believed that only a species with the right balance of strength, wisdom, and compassion should wield such power. Under their examination, the Aegis revealed marvels that defied belief. It could adapt to any environment, shielding its wearer from the vacuum of space or the crushing depths of a gas giant. It enhanced strength and speed to levels that made even the Kroll seem sluggish. Its surface could shift from an impenetrable barrier to a flexible, self-repairing mesh at a thought. But it was the Aegis effect on Jake himself that truly astounded. His mind seemed to expand, processing information at a rate that left their most advanced AI in the dust. He spoke of distant stars and long-lost civilizations as if he had seen them firsthand, recalling details with perfect clarity. It's not just a suit of armor, Jake explained, a note of reverence in his voice. It's a repository of knowledge, a conduit for the wisdom of the progenitors. When I wear it, I can tap into that knowledge, see through their eyes. The gathered researchers listened in awe, their earlier suspicions and fears giving way to a growing sense of excitement. With each new revelation, each demonstration of the Aegis capabilities, they began to understand the true scope of what they had found. But along with that excitement came a growing sense of unease. Jake's warnings about the Vorlons, the mysterious threat he claimed was coming, hung over them like a shadow. Zilarvex pulled Jake aside, his expression grave. These Vorlons, what are they? Why do they pose such a danger? Jake's face darkened, a haunted look in his eyes. They are the antithesis of everything the progenitors stood for, a race twisted by their own power, consumed by the need to dominate and control. He looked down at his armored hands, clenching them into fists. The Aegis was created to stand against them, to find a champion capable of facing their might. And now, after centuries of waiting, it has chosen. Zilarvex felt a weight settle on his shoulders, a realization of the responsibility they now bore. He looked around at his fellow researchers, saw the same determination kindling in their eyes. They had started this journey as seekers of knowledge, driven by curiosity and the thirst for discovery. But now, faced with a threat that could engulf the galaxy, they found themselves on the brink of something far greater. With the human and the Aegis as their guides, they would unlock the armor's secrets. They would stand against the coming darkness. And the future of all the galaxy, they knew, hung in the balance. An ancient threat returns. The attack came without warning. One moment, the skies above Xyloth Prime were clear, the stars glimmering in peaceful serenity. The next, the darkness was rent by lances of searing light, the very fabric of space twisting and buckling. In the research facility, alarms blared, sensors screaming in overload. Xylarvex stared at the readings in disbelief, his heart's pounding. The energy signatures were off the scale, like nothing he had ever seen. Beside him, Jake stood grim and resolute, the Aegis armor pulsing with coiled potential. "It's them," he said, his voice heavy with dread. "The Vorlons. They'd found us." The arrival was chaos, a simultaneous assault on a dozen systems. Vorlon ships, vast and implacable, materialized from the void, their hulls pulsing with malevolent light. Planetary defenses crumbled before their onslaught, fleets scattering like leaves before a hurricane. Frantic transmissions poured into the facility, each more desperate than the last. The Kroll homeworld, their mighty war machine brought to its knees in a matter of hours. The Elzari, their psychic might turned against them, driven mad by whispers from the dark. One by one, the lights of the galaxy were going out, snuffed by an unstoppable tide. In the heart of the maelstrom, Xyloth Prime stood alone, a last bastion against the Vorlon advance. But even their vaunted technology, their unity in the face of this threat, seemed a frail bulwark against the coming storm. "We have to evacuate," Xylarvex said, his voice shaking. "Get as many as we can to the escape shuttles. If the Vorlons take this world, they won't." Jake cut him off, his eyes blazing with an inner fire. The Aegis armor seemed to pulse in response, its surface shimmering with barely contained power. "This is what the armor was made for, what I was made for." He turned to the gathered researchers, his voice ringing with authority. "Get your people to safety. I'll hold them off." There was a moment of stunned silence, broken only by the distant thunder of orbital bombardment. Then Xylarvex stepped forward, his expression a mix of awe and concern. "You can't face them alone," he said. "This is a force that has brought entire civilizations to ruin. Even with the Aegis." Jake laid a hand on Xylarvex's shoulder, and the Xylothian felt a surge of strength, of courage, flowing from that touch. "Trust me," Jake said, a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "I've got a few tricks up my sleeve." With that, he turned and strode towards the facility's launch bay, the armor shifting and reconfiguring around him. As Xylarvex watched, Jake's form was encased in a shimmering field of force, lifting him from the ground in a blaze of light. The last thing Xylarvex saw as the human rocketed into the sky was a flash of that same grin, a jaunty salute. Then he was gone, a streak of brilliance against the darkness of the Vorlon assault. Around him, the researchers scrambled to follow Jake's orders, herding personnel towards the escape craft. But Xylarvex found himself rooted in place, staring at the screens that tracked the battle unfolding above. A single point of light, blazing defiantly against the void. A human, clad in the armor of the ancients, facing down the might of the Vorlons. It should have been impossible. It should have been suicide. But as he watched, hope kindling in his hearts, Xylarvex began to believe in the impossible. Turning the tide. In the skies above Xyloth Prime, a battle unlike any the galaxy had seen rage. The Vorlon fleet, vast and terrible, clustered around the planet like a swarm of angry locusts, their weapons carving swaths of destruction across the surface. And against them, a lone figure, wreathed in the shimmering aura of the Aegis armor. Jake moved through the void like a force of nature, the armor responding to his every thought and impulse. He wove between the lances of energy that sought to tear him apart, the Aegis shields flaring with each impact. In his wake, Vorlon ships crumbled, their hulls twisting and warping under the assault of the armor's weaponry. Beams of pure force, hotter than the heart of a star, sliced through their defenses like a scalpel through flesh. Gravitational pulses crushed them into unrecognizable ruins, scattering their remains to the stellar winds. It was a display of power beyond anything Xylarvex had dared to imagine. The Aegis, he realized with a shock, had been holding back in their tests, revealing only a fraction of its true capabilities. And Jake, the human, moved with a grace and precision that seemed almost inhuman, anticipating the Vorlons' every move, striking at their weaknesses with devastating accuracy. It was as if he and the armor were one entity, a perfect fusion of man and machine. But even with the Aegis' might, the odds were staggering. The Vorlons kept coming, pouring from the depths of space like an endless tide. For every ship Jake destroyed, a dozen more took its place, their weapons growing more frenzied, more desperate with each passing moment. How can he hope to prevail against such numbers? One of the researchers whispered, her voice trembling. Even the Aegis must have its limits. Xylarvex said nothing, his gaze locked on the screens. He had seen something in Jake's eyes before the human had left, a glint of determination that went beyond mere bravery or defiance. The human had a plan, he was certain. The question was, would it be enough? High above, the battle reached a fever pitch. The Vorlons, sensing the threat Jake posed, focused their full might on him, space itself warping under the onslaught. The Aegis shields flared, flickered, the armor's surface beginning to crack and warp under the strain. But Jake fought on, a roar of defiance on his lips. And as Xylarvex watched, the human began to push towards the heart of the Vorlon formation, towards the massive ship that dwarfed all the others. The Vorlon flagship, a monstrosity of twisted metal and pulsing energy. It hung in space like a malevolent god, its weapons capable of reducing worlds to cinders. Jake hurtled towards it, the Aegis shields straining, crackling under the barrage of fire. Xylarvex found himself leaning forward, his breath caught in his throat. Surely Jake didn't intend to, but he did. With a final desperate surge of speed, Jake plunged into the heart of the flagship, the Aegis aura flaring in a blinding burst of light. For a moment, there was silence. The Vorlon fleet, the researchers, the entire galaxy seemed to hold its breath. Then the flagship exploded in a cataclysm of energy, a supernova bloom of light and fury. The shockwave ripped through the Vorlon ranks, tearing ships apart like paper, scattering their formation to the void. And from the heart of the maelstrom, a figure emerged. Battered, scorched, but alive. The Aegis and the human within had done the impossible. They had turned the tide. Legacy. In the aftermath of the battle, a stunned silence hung over Xyloth Prime. The skies, so recently filled with the fury of the Vorlon onslaught, were now clear, the stars shining down on a world that had been snatched from the brink of annihilation. In the ruins of the research facility, Xylarvex and his team gathered, their eyes locked on the figure descending from the heavens. Jake, the human who had stood against the might of the Vorlons, and emerged victorious. As he touched down, the Aegis armor retracted, revealing the man beneath. He looked exhausted, his face lined with fatigue and strain, but his eyes burned with a fierce, undimmed light. Xylarvex stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. "You did it," he said, the words seeming inadequate to the magnitude of the moment. "You saved us all." Jake smiled, a weary but triumphant grin. "Not just me," he said, laying a hand on the armor's surface. "The Aegis, it's more than just a suit of armor. It's a legacy, a testament to the wisdom and sacrifice of those who came before." He looked out over the gathered researchers, his expression growing serious. The progenitors created the Aegis as a shield against the darkness, a tool to empower those who would stand against the likes of the Vorlons. But they knew that power alone was not enough. Jake tapped his chest, over his heart. "The Aegis chose me not for my strength, but for my spirit, for the human capacity for courage, compassion, and self-sacrifice. These are the qualities that the progenitors believed were necessary to wield such power responsibly." Xylarvex nodded, understanding dawning. And that's why it rejected all the others, he said, because they sought the armor for their own gain, their own power. Exactly, Jake said. The Aegis is not a weapon to be wielded lightly. It's a responsibility, a duty to use its power for the good of all. That's the legacy of the progenitors, the lesson they wanted to impart. He looked up at the stars, a wistful expression on his face. And it's a lesson that humanity learned long ago. We too faced the temptation of power without wisdom, of might without mercy. But we grew, we evolved. We learned to temper our strength with compassion, our ambition with understanding. Jake turned back to the researchers, his eyes kindling with hope. And that's the gift we offer to the galaxy. Not just our technology or our strength, but our perspective, our hard-won wisdom, the understanding that true power lies not in what you can destroy, but what you can protect. Xylar Vex felt a swell of emotion rising in his chest, a sense of profound awe and gratitude. He looked at Jake, at this human who embodied the best of his species, and he knew that the galaxy would never be the same. From this day forward, the name of Jake Hansen would be spoken with reverence, the story of his deeds passed down through generations. The human who had worn the Aegis, who had stood against the darkness and emerged unbroken. But more than that, it was the story of humanity itself that would endure. The story of a young species that had looked into the abyss and found, not despair, but hope. That had reached out to the stars not in conquest, but in fellowship. And as Xylar Vex looked around at his fellow researchers, at the awe and respect in their eyes, he knew that this was only the beginning. With humanity at their side, with the wisdom of the progenitors to guide them, there was no limit to what they could achieve, no darkness they could not face, no challenge they could not overcome. The legacy of the Aegis and of the human spirit would live on, and the galaxy would be forever changed by its light. The end.